Now, aside from hierarchy and centrality, we also have to think about the gendered nature of cliques. Although we certainly do have mixed gendered cliques, a lot of research has been poured into how cliques vary if they tend to contain all girls or all boys. Now, this is a very busy slide. I had a lot going on. And what I was trying to show was that especially not just in terms of how they're gendered, what happens in the clique, but they're also gendered in terms of how they can climb the hierarchy or be pushed down the hierarchy, which is why you see the zip line and the slide and the stairs, trying to show that there's different modes of changing status within these groups based on if it's girls or boys. So let's talk about cliques that are made up of girls. So what we find is that on average, typically, cliques that are all girl-based tend to be much more rigid than cliques that are all boy-based. There tends to be much more stratification in the hierarchy, with more of a clear leader or queen bee. So the leadership tends to be more focused on things like someone who has higher academic success, higher levels of physical attractiveness, and higher levels of income. Those tend to be the girls that get picked to be the leader of the hierarchy. We also find that within groups, if there's going to be delinquency tends to help them to rise in status. That when a girl is more delinquent, it helps her to push herself and show that she's more autonomous, and it helps her to increase her status. In fact, when we see someone perhaps smoking in junior high or in high school, smoking in girls tends to be used so that they appear more socially advanced. So a girl who picks up smoking is considered to be more mature and more advanced, and that can help her to improve her status. However, in girl cliques, there tends to be a lot more jealousy, a lot more tension, and a lot more distress over the thought of losing status and losing friends. So because of that rigidity, there's a lot more weight placed on where one appears in the hierarchy and a lot more preoccupation with that. As comparison with boys cliques tend to be a lot more dynamic, a lot more loosely defined. It tends to be that they're not really sure who's in their clique. It could change. It could be they want to go play baseball, and who's available to come on Tuesday this week may not be who's available next week, and that's okay. They'll just change them out. And so the cliques tend to be more flat, less hierarchical, and the leader may be less well defined. But if somebody is going to be the leader, they tend to be someone who is especially athletic, somebody who's especially tough, and somebody who appears cool. And coolness here is somebody who appears self-assured or more mature. That being said, although delinquency may not help them to rise up in status, delinquency on a whole tends to be a lot more prevalent in boy-only cliques. And delinquency may be something considerably mild like physical aggression or roughhousing, but delinquency may be something like smoking. And we actually find that in junior high, boys don't smoke to appear more socially mature. Boys actually tend to prefer smoking to help them deal with their insecurity. So they may be smoking because they don't know what to do with their hands, or they feel awkward, or they just don't want to have to be preoccupied with their anxious thoughts, so they'll start to smoke. Now what happens in these boy cliques is because they're larger and less well defined, there's less pressure. And so they're much more flat and boys can come and go. Now, how do we know all this about cliques? Well, the research by Dr. Thomas Kinderman has really started to show how people identify as part of cliques, who are part of their cliques. And this is really complicated research to perform. Two techniques are the social network analysis, also known as SNA, and this is where you just give someone a blank piece of paper and ask them to list up to 10 of their friends. And if you ask a large group, a high school or junior high group to do this, eventually you'll be able to figure out who is friends with who and map these social networks. Kinderman's approach is a little bit more advanced than that, and that is the social cognitive map, or the SCM. And this is where you don't just list who your friends are, but you also list who hangs out together. So you're also seeing what the reputations are like. And so you ask kids, list who you hang out with, but then list who else hangs out together. So you might not be part of the hockey kids, but you assume these 8 kids in your class are all the hockey kids, so you put their name down together. And after you do that, Kinderman's approach encourages students to circle the leader. So who's the leader of the hockey kids? Who's the leader of the druggies or the burnouts? Who's the leader of the Dungeons and Dragons geek group? And so this is the idea that you are identifying the groups that you perceive and also the leaders you perceive. This approach, the social cognitive map, can be very important to help us to identify who are the more central members, the kids who get more nominations for the group. Perhaps everybody identified the same 8 hockey kids, but then there was 3 other kids that are sometimes identified as part of the hockey group, but sometimes not. Well, those are probably the more peripheral members, and so they receive less nominations for that group. So this is how we can go about identifying what happens here. Now, in terms of the outcomes associated with this, we do find that if people are more so nominated to be the leaders, this tends to be linked with higher prevalences of direct aggression in boys. Not necessarily physical aggression, but direct aggression. So direct to one's face, verbal intimidation, or something of that nature. And so boys who are more often the leader tend to display higher levels of direct aggression, versus girls who are more often nominated to be the leader of these cliques tend to display higher levels of indirect aggression. So it shows that leadership really can take its toll. But we also find that the kids that are more often to be nominated as the leaders tend to have more influence over other people. So being that leader comes with a lot of power, where they can really influence the behavioral and social norms for their groups and crowds. Now, what did Kinderman's research find in terms of the membership of these groups? Well, across multiple studies, on average, it's been found that in North American junior high schools, about 50% of the cliques that exist are girl only. But 25% of the cliques that existed were boys only. Now remember, these cliques might vary in size. And about 25% of the cliques identified were mixed gender. And so this is the idea that there are lots of hybrids, despite that there's not a lot of research on those mixed gender groups. Now, about 25% of the cliques in Kinderman's research actually find that the cliques had no leaders, that they would be more flat, or maybe they were too small to have a leader. Maybe it was a friendship of 3 and nobody's really the leader. 15% of cliques had multiple leaders. So maybe it's a friendship of 3 and they all consider themselves a leader, or maybe a group of 6 and there's 2 that are really the co-leaders. And importantly, 8% of students had no clique. So that's who belongs to the groups. Now, how do these groups influence some of our behaviors? Well, it's important to understand how these groups could influence things like direct and indirect aggression or substance abuse. And there's a lot of numbers going on in this slide, but there's a couple takeaways I want you to understand. When we look at girls' cliques versus boys' cliques versus the overall cliques, we actually find the girls' cliques tend to account most for the problematic behavior. The percentages are higher. And so what this means is there's more variance accounted for based on what group you belong to. If girls are going to be aggressive, whether direct or indirect, that tends to be predicted based on who their friends are. Girls who have more aggressive friends will be more directly and indirectly aggressive and be more likely to use substances, versus girls that have friends that are not aggressive or using substances are much less likely to do so. So that's what's going on with those more higher percentages. Versus when we look at boys, well, we can see they're less impacted. When it comes to substance abuse, who boys' friends only predicts 14% of whether they will abuse substances in adolescence. So this means that their friends aren't really influencing that. There's other factors driving that. So for girls, it really seems that their group really has more influence on them. And that makes sense given that we know girls' groups tend to be a lot more rigid and a lot more hierarchical, and they put a lot more preoccupation into their groups on average.